Hello and welcome to this Net English walkthrough, today focusing on the poem Kamikaze. And let's start with a quick read-through of the poem. So, Kamikaze. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats, strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes, like a huge flag waved first one way and then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swivelled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers waiting on the shore built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles, to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes. And the neighbours, too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he'd never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wandered, which had been the better way to die. So Beatrice Garland was born in 1938, and she's a British poet, teacher, clinician and a researcher. She's spoken about poetry as being a way of talking about how each of us sees, is touched by, grasps and responds to our own different worlds and the people in them. And her work explores interpersonal connection, the self, and the way we construct the world around us. The poem Kamikaze is taken from Garland's 2013 collection, The Invention of Fireworks, with the poems in the collection showcasing her style of vivid visual imagery and a focus on sensory details and tactile qualities. However, Garland also generally retains a sense of personal distance between her adopted narrative voices and the subjects on which they focus, and that's allowing and encouraging a sense of observation and reflection rather than a fully immersive involvement. In terms of the title, Kamikaze refers to a group of Japanese pilots in World War II. Kamikaze pilots would be sent on missions in which their own aeroplanes would be the final weapon, flown into enemy ships in a deliberate suicide attack. The idea of the kamikaze pilot drew on the tradition of obedience and the desire for honourable death that you find in Japanese military culture, though the poem also has contemporary resonances. In the poem, Garland focuses on the imagined perspective of the daughter of a kamikaze pilot. In the daughter's voice, Garland imagines the circumstance that led to the narrator's father, a kamikaze pilot, changing his mind halfway through the mission, and reflecting also on his subsequent treatment by his family and his community. During the poem, Garland moves between several perspectives, including the third-person account of the anonymous narrator, her, a speculative engagement with the father's viewpoint, and also the adult daughter's first-person reflections. The poem begins with the father having embarked at sunrise, equipped with a flask of water and a samurai sword. The image of sunrise is appropriate. The Japanese name for Japan literally translates as the origin of the sun, and it's often referred to as the land of the rising sun. It's even reported that medieval samurai carried drawings of the sun on their fans. As a symbol, it represents celebration, birth, childhood, life. There's obviously an irony to the image of the sun as linked to life, and of sunrise as linked to the beginning of life, since the father is actually embarking on a mission that's intended to end with his death and the deaths of those he attacks. But that also foreshadows the cyclical nature of life and living that is, it's implied, at the heart of his decision not to complete his mission. The flask of water is a functional thing, something to ensure that the pilot survives long enough to complete his mission. But it's also noticeable that there's no other source of sustenance, there's no food. That's not intended to be a lengthy mission. Samurai are important within the poem. The father's equipped with a samurai sword as a practical measure, so if facing capture, pilots were expected to commit ritual suicide. But it's also to symbolise the sense of the kamikaze pilots as the modern-day equivalents of the samurai, those elite and semi-mythical medieval Japanese warriors known for their honour, skill, heroism, and their willingness to embrace death as a measure of their loyalty and dedication. Now, there's a jarring mismatch for many readers between the contextually specific view of the kamikaze pilots, so these heroic individual warriors sacrificing themselves for patriotism and honour, and for some, a more modern view where we see them as deluded groups of men sold a lie and manipulated into wasting their lives. Historically, kamikaze pilots arose when Japan was losing the war in the air, and the pilot-guided and increasingly outdated planes were seen as more accurate and more likely to hit their target than missiles were. Many, if not most, of the kamikaze pilots were minimally trained, they were inexperienced, they were young, and they were naive. Now, the pilot has a shaven head full of powerful incantations. Now, pilots spent the weeks before their mission focusing on their physical and spiritual preparations. And in addition to the praise and admiration they received, the pilots were also indoctrinated with expectations of spiritual reward, and they flew equipped with a death poem. Now, every aspect of their preparation and their mission was ritualized, made into a quasi-religious ceremony, preparing them for a journey into history, both a journey into becoming history, dead, part of the past, but also becoming part of something great and something glorious in the sense of making history. Of course, they're only given enough fuel for a one-way journey. It's a practical measure, why waste fuel, though it also doubled as an additional explosive material, but it's also a means of ensuring that the journey has to be one way, because it can't not be. In the second stanza, the perspective becomes more ambiguous. We shift from the known details, so sunrise, flask, sword, and so on, to the speculative. After all, and as we discover during the poem, nothing more is known about the father's thoughts or actions, because on his return he was treated as though he no longer existed, and even the children learned to be silent. It's only with her own children later that the narrator discusses and considers her father's perspective. And notice, the movement from the journey into history to the pilot's moment of reflection, halfway there, is emphasized by being split across the two stanzas. The daughter assumes, she thought, that he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats. The fishing boats are strung out like bunting, something celebratory and unifying, which is ironic considering the lack of celebration for his return, and also representing continuity and community, but also juxtaposing the functional reality of the boats and the fishing, associated with life and living, as is the green-blue translucent sea, with the public symbols of the bunting and the huge flag waved first one way, then the other. The waving of the flag could refer to something triumphant, so the flag is a symbol of patriotism and victory, or to the signalling of the plane for departure. But the figure of 8 is also relevant, perhaps, in terms of representing infinity, the infinity that pilots believed they were pursuing, the immortality of heroism, but potentially also just the absolute finality of death. That the flag is an image used to describe the dark shoals of fishes is appropriate, I think. From the point of view of living, the catching of fish is a victory, something that enables and sustains life. But also because the fish are living things, that link to the continuity of the family, from the grandfather's boat to the daughter's own children, with the flashing silver showing their value. The fish are, of course, a collective group, as is the family, juxtaposed with the isolation of the individual pilot at all points in the poem, but the fish are also associated with light and hope and positivity, as in flashing, including through their orientation, swiveled towards the sun. It's natural in this sense, I think, that the image of the fish, as in collective, positive, life, family, prompts the memory of how he and his brothers were waiting on the shore for their father's boat to return safely. Now, cairns are built for two main reasons. They can be a constructed marker or a burial mound. Now here, it seems to be both, something jointly constructed by he and his brothers, but also a sign of the potential for death or the fear of loss in terms of their father, grandfather's boat. There's an obvious parallel between the pilot's thoughts, his children at home, perhaps dreaming or waiting for their father's safe and life-affirming return, and his childhood memories or experiences, waiting with his brothers for their father's safe return from the ocean. The pearl grey pebbles seem to juxtapose the mundane and the commonplace, they're pebbles, with the rare and the precious, the pearl, perhaps symbolizing the value of the individual lives that seem small and meaningless from the outside, but that are precious from the point of view of family members. There's also the question of the cairns attempting to withstand the turbulent inrush of breakers. Now the tension here is between the constructed, human-created, the cairn, and the wider forces to which they are subjected, and that's a parallel for the individual and their life against the powerful cultural, contextual, social, and familial influences on them. Life and living is also the focus of the vivid description of the fish on grandfather's boat. The boat's not simply remembered for the safe return of the father's father, but for being loaded with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait. Now again, the fish represent life and positivity. Silver to go with the flashing silver and the pearl grey. And they're linked implicitly to sustenance, both nutritionally and economically. They're both to eat and to sell. The use of sibilants in safe to the shore, salt sodden, almost offers a sense of the ocean noises in the background. And there's also the sense of the significance of the tuna, the dark prince, muscular, a specific and special memory, something of particular and individual value, contrasted with the anonymity of the smaller fish. There's a potential and popular interpretation that the fish represent being trapped by cultural expectations and context, so caught in a net, exploited, and so on, with the power of the ocean representing the inevitability of their course in life. However, this doesn't seem to fit with the beauty and the appreciative tone used to describe them. Cloud-marked, feathery, loose silver. These are beautiful, they're valuable, perhaps fragile. These are not descriptions of trapped and empty objects, which would suggest the pilot consciously rebels against this functional construction of himself, but of shared vitality and intense and vibrant childhood memories of celebration and happiness. The pilot doesn't return home because he realizes how trapped he is, but because he's choosing life, the collective experiences of his childhood, family, and so that his children have the same positive experience that he and his brothers did when their father returned. The sense of the continuity of the experience through the poem to this point has been emphasized by the enjambment. The pilot had been steered into a natural-seeming progression that will end with his death. However, the flow's been disrupted. Instead, the end-stopping of the line after muscular, dangerous, represents the moment of choice, the point at which he decides not to complete his mission, the moment in which he chooses life over death. Now, there is a shift, a volta, between the 5th and 6th stanzas, and it's reflected in the movement to italics. We've already moved from a third-person explanation of the mother's recollection of her own father in stanzas 1 to 2, to the speculative consideration of the father's perspective in stanzas 2 to 5. And here we shift again into a first-person account written in the mother's own voice. Now, the shift is also reflected in the movement from the beauty and the poetic lyricism of the fish and the ocean being described to the blunt reality to which the narrator's father returned. Instead of the loving family of his own childhood, he and his brothers, he's instead greeted by silence and abandonment. My mother never spoke again in his presence, and couldn't even meet his eyes. The neighbours treated him as though he no longer existed. And perhaps most depressingly, I think, even the children who still chattered and laughed eventually learned to be silent and to live as though he'd never returned, as if he was no longer the father we loved. Having chosen life, both his own and those that he chose not to attack, he chose family, love, childhood, innocence, beauty, nature. Instead, the father is sentenced to a living death of isolation, abandonment, silence, and exclusion. Now this links again back to strictures and structured codes within Japanese culture of the time, of honor in sacrifice, of duty. The poet has transgressed these carefully constructed and socially imposed boundaries. For those to whom he's returned, his existence, his life, is a source of shame. He's seen as a coward, dishonourable. The final two lines return to the perspective of the mother, the pilot's daughter, considering how her father must have felt, that he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Having chosen life, the father is living his own ongoing and enduring death. And notice that the poem that began with sunrise ends with die. And it's unclear, I think, whether a literal death or a metaphorical or the social one would have been preferable. The final and the saddest irony, of course, is that the pilot's daughter, the mother in the poem, and the person narrating part of the poem, has to assume what he thought and felt. He must have wondered, she tells us. She can't know what happened on the plane, what he thought, what he felt, whether he regretted his decision after returning, precisely because my mother never spoke again in his presence, precisely because we two learned to be silent, precisely because they had to live as though he'd never returned. To turn, then, to comparisons to be made with other poems in the anthology. The personal impact of conflict makes poems such as Poppies and The Emigre quite natural choices, I think. However, it would also be possible to compare the poem to others focusing on the negative impact of choices. That could include, say, Remains or War Photographer. Conflict in a broader sense could also link the poem to others such as Exposure or Bayonet Charge, and those could work quite well, particularly with the contrast in terms of the personal perspective. Hopefully that's been useful. Now, as ever, please don't forget that there's a whole range of videos covering all the language and literature topics, including all the rest of the poems, on the Net English YouTube channel, which is NET English 1 on youtube.com. And also there's the podcast you can access as well. Thank you very much for your time.